Okay, so welcome everyone. Just so you heard we started the recording. So we're going to start today. So good snowy morning to you all from Montreal and good time of the day to wherever you are. My name is Katie Millette. I'm the Executive Secretary of GEO BON, and we'd like to welcome you to our webinar on the IPBES nomination of experts and fellows as an information webinar to pass to you all, the interested participants in joining the IPBES expert process. Today, we have, here's the agenda for today. We'll first introduce today's speakers that we have for you. We have some knowledgeable experts on the IPBES process. We have a short poll we'd like to ask you to get to know your background as participants interested in the IPBES process. Then we will provide some information on IPBES itself, a short background on what it is, and the background information on the assessment calls that are currently out. And then we'll talk about the process of nominating experts. So if you are interested in doing that, we'll talk to you about that and what our internal endorsement process will be. So if you're seeking endorsement from an observer group like GEO BON, we will have an endorsement process and we'll outline what that is with you. And then lastly, the bulk of this webinar will be here to answer your questions. So if you have any questions that we don't talk about in the webinar, we'd like to address them with you here, and now's the time. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat. If you see a question that is also a question you have, give it a little reaction, maybe a thumbs up or something, and that way we'll know those questions are high priority, so we can try to address those ones first. Okay, so for today, we have David O'Burra, who is the IPBES chair. He's joining us right now from Norway. He's the director of Cordio East Africa. We're happy to have him here today. Then we'll hear from Cornelia Krug, who is the director of the biodiscovery program at Future Earth. She's part of the GEO BON policy task force. She's a co-lead, and she's also a professor at University of Zurich. Then you'll hear from Leticia Navarro, who is an MSCA research fellow. She's also the GEO BON Policy Task Force co-lead, and she's at the EBD. And then lastly, myself, the executive secretary at GEO BON at McGill. So the slides we'll be presenting today are adapted from the IPBES Secretariat itself. So they provided an information webinar, but we've adapted it and tailored it more for our audience, which are mostly GEO BON members. So right now, I'll just turn it over to David, who's going to give us a few moving words on behalf of IPBES. David, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks very much, Katie. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here in the GEO BON webinar because I've been a member, still am a member of GEO BON and the Marine BON component of GEO BON. I'm really grateful to Katie and Leticia and Cornelia for letting me crash this webinar, because when I saw that it was GEO BON presenting on IPBES participation, I really wanted to come and say a few words now that I've recently become the IPBES chair in the last few months, which means I'm responsible for sort of promoting IPBES and moving it forward in what it attempts to do. And I'm at a workshop of the IPBES national focal points in Norway right now, so a chance for me to get to know some of the national representatives. So I apologize I won't be able to stay on the call, but if there are any questions or issues that I can help with follow up on, I'm happy to do that afterwards. So I mean, I've come from the same background as many of you in terms of being in monitoring systems and working with GEO BON and coral reef monitoring networks around the world. And so I thought I'd just sort of describe my pathway to help motivate. If any of you are wondering about the utility of participating in IPBES, I'm sure many of you are interested because you're on the call, but perhaps you can spread the word and get others to join in as well. I mean, it's really about the use of science in society and the contributions we can make from all of the efforts that we put into building up our science and monitoring networks. And IPBES is really one of the growing as perhaps one of the principal processes for getting biodiversity information into societal and decision-making contexts. And the more we have really good scientists and science going into our assessments and participating in the task forces and processes, you know, the more credible our outputs will be and the more we can contribute. And we work through countries, so we really strengthen the process of countries to be able to use science. So that's very important. And so I've sort of, in the last few years, with really wanting to try and make a difference for coral reefs, moved more and more sort of out of the science, primary science processes and towards these science policy platforms to contribute into them, because of, the frustration with our results not being used enough, and wanting to further that process. I'll just make a couple of quick points about the various things that are being put before you in the seminar. One is the importance of the scientific assessments, and these are really the backbone of what IPBES does. Just like with the IPCC, the principal assessments do carry more and more weight over time, and it's well worth the time that you put in. I participated first in a global assessment, then a biodiversity climate one. And then I was a co-chair of the Nexus assessment, which is ongoing and out for review, as you'll hear about now. So I've, clearly felt it's more and more important to do it and put more and more time into it. Now, as the chair of the platform, I have to pull out of leading a science assessment because it best puts a firewall between the governance and the science part to make sure there's no intrusion of political aspects into the scientific assessments themselves. But for GEO BON in particular, I think the assessment that's being opened up soon on the monitoring assessment for the GBF is perhaps the most powerful way to really get our biodiversity observing networks really recognized and validated for how important they are in making decision-making at the top of the international platforms. Of course, the assessment will come out late in the day for the GBF itself, because it won't come out until, I think, 2026, perhaps. But it'll be a really important platform for what happens next. The important thing about assessments is it's not just about, your own individual indicators and networks and how strong they are. It's an integration of the science. So, when you participate in an assessment, it's really about integrating and identifying what the strongest scientific confidence is and promoting that and critical reflection. If you can't join the assessment itself, please join the review processes. They take less time, of course, but they are critically important in bringing in new insights. So for the monitoring assessments in due course, but also for the current assessments that are out for review. For early career scientists, the fellows process and becoming a contributing author or lead author in these assessments is a great way to build your careers and to build your networks, particularly in developing regions. If you have a lot of constraints around being able to develop your programs and networking, IPBES is a fantastic platform for that. And because it promotes inclusion and regional diversity and gender, of course. And then the task forces as well are ongoing work programs under IPBES that you can contribute to in very creative ways. The last thing I'll say is the endorsement process from GEO BON, as Katie mentioned at the beginning. IPBES does have, so it's a country-led process. So for assessments, at least 80% of the participants do need to be nominated by countries. So if you have the opportunity to nominate from a country, please do that, because it does, especially from developing countries, it does give you a bit more sort of leverage in moving forward. But also the GEO BON endorsement is, of course, very important for many, and I think, and does certainly help. And if you can get that as well, I think having the two, I'm not sure if two can happen, but that's also very useful. So I'll stop with that. I didn't have any slides. I was just here to give a few overarching words and to really encourage you to participate, because it's been a very validating process for me. And I think, particularly as you're coming up through the systems and developing your engagement, IPBES is a great platform, and the more we can strengthen it with some of you, the better. And so I'll say thanks for having some of the time. Great to see some familiar faces and names in the list, and of course, get to meet some new ones as well as we go forward. So thanks, Katie. I think I'll just finish with that.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for those moving words. Okay, so before we jump into it, we have a short poll that we would like to share with you. Oops. So it's more about getting to know you as a participant and what is your sort of level of interest here. So I'm just going to launch the poll now. Is everyone seeing the poll? Someone give me a thumbs up. Is it launched? No?
Not yet, Katie.
Okay. And there we go.
Here.
All right, great. So there's 6 questions there. Answer them as best as you can. They're not mandatory, I don't believe, so. But we'd like, of course, to get answers for each of the 6 questions. Okay, we have about 50% participation. Maybe about another minute and a half. %, almost done. And 10 seconds, we're going to end the poll. So thanks to everyone that answered. That's really useful and helpful for us. There we go. So it seems like we know somewhat about IPBES, so some people here have some familiarity with it, but obviously would like to know more. The top areas of expertise seems to be ecology, terrestrial systems, marine.
Katie, we can't see anything. I'm not sure if you're supposed. Yeah, now, thanks.
Thank you. So the results are there. You should be able to scroll through. We have a lot of representation from the WIGA group, so Western Europe. A lot of participants in GEO BON and working groups, and mixed on seeking endorsement. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop sharing the results now and hand the floor over to Cornelia, who's going to talk to us about IPBES itself. So Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm Cornelia Krug, and unlike Katie said, I'm not a professor. I'm a senior researcher at the University of Zurich, and I've been working at the science policy interface for the last 15 years. I originally have a degree in ecology. I worked on the impacts of environmental change on various ecological communities, mostly in Southern Africa. But I moved back to Europe in 2010 to join Diversitas as a science officer for biodiscovery, and I moved to Zurich 6 years ago and became the director of biodiscovery and also work here on the science policy. I've been involved with IPBES essentially from the beginning, so even before it was actually started. It's quite interesting because a lot of negotiations around IPBES actually took place in France, were initiated by France, and then Anne-Laure Gaudry, who's now the executive secretary of IPBES, was my boss at Diversitas. So the links between my work and IPBES have always been fairly strong. I've been involved with the IPBES task force on knowledge and data as a resource person for the last 7 years. And I've done a few reviews of the assessments, but myself have never been an author of an assessment. So I'm here to actually tell you a little bit what IPBES actually is, what IPBES does, what the IPBES assessment actually are, and what the role of the task forces within IPBES actually is. Some of it might actually already be familiar to you. You've indicated that you know somewhat about IPBES, but I think we'll cover this nonetheless. Okay, Katie, can you advance the slides? So IPBES is the other intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. If I explain to people who've never heard of IPBES what it actually is, I usually say it's the IPCC for biodiversity. But I think there's a big difference between IPCC and IPBES. They're both science policy processes. They rely on the most current science. They do scientific assessments, but where IPBES is really strong also is actually thinking about, on the one hand, on engaging stakeholders in the processes. That's something that's actually not done at IPCC. And then also IPBES is really at the forefront in thinking about how to actually integrate other types of knowledge, especially indigenous knowledge, into the processes of the platform. So I think that's a really strong point of IPBES. The mission is to strengthen the knowledge foundations for better policy through science, for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being and sustainable development, and that's mostly done through the assessment processes. IPBES has been established in 2012 as an independent body. And at the moment, there are actually 145 member states and countless, I actually don't know how many organizations that are part of IPBES. The secretariat is hosted in Bonn in Germany. Yes, next slide, Katie. Yeah, and here's an overview over the 6 objectives that IPBES actually has. And now with the current work program that was agreed on at the last IPBES plenary, there are now 4 task forces that are actually now being put in place. So there was the call for task force experts recently that closed in November this year. So the first objective, and I think that's the most important one for us that we're going to talk about, is the assessing knowledge. So thinking about what the current knowledge on biodiversity ecosystems, but also the use of biodiversity actually is, and how biodiversity contributes to human well-being. Then the second objective is actually building on this, is building the capacity, mostly in the policy, about how to actually implement the science, how to actually move from the assessment to policy implementation. But there's also a big component about building capacity in the scientific community as well, especially in terms of incorporating different knowledge systems. Then another great big objective that actually is important for us here in the community is the strengthening of the knowledge foundations. Then we've got the objective of supporting policy. So that's mostly addressed to policymakers. And then there's the communicating and engaging and improving effectiveness of the platform that are actually less important for us. There are 4 task forces. Sorry, Katie, can you just go back? the task force on capacity building. So that's the one that actually really thinks about how to actually involve policymakers in the process of implementing the assessment outcomes. And then the two task forces, one on data and knowledge, and the one on indigenous and local knowledge, they're really there to strengthen the knowledge foundations. The task force on data and knowledge, for example, is instrumental in at the moment working, for example, with funders to actually make sure that the gaps that are being found in the IPBES assessment are being addressed in research in the future. And then, of course, the task force on indigenous and local knowledge is there to actually make sure that indigenous and local knowledge is brought into the assessments. And then we've got the task force on scenarios and models that actually is thinking about not on the work of the policy instruments, but is also developing the whole Nature Futures framework and its implementation. Next slide, please. Yes, so the IPBES assessments, they are there to establish the knowledge base for decision making. They are methodological assessments like the pollination assessment, the scenarios and models assessment, but also the values assessment. Then the thematic assessments, for example, on sustainable use of species or invasive species, that's another thematic assessment. The regional assessments that came out in 2018 in Europe and Central Asia, Europe and Central Europe, what is ECAS, Europe and Central Asia assessment, Asia Pacific assessment, the Americas and the Africa regional assessment. And then the flagship report of IPBES is the global assessment that was published in 2019. And these reports not only give an overview over the current status of biodiversity and ecosystems, but they also always think about what's the relationship of biodiversity with humans, the role of biodiversity for human well-being, and also always thinking about the future. So how is the future of biodiversity and ecosystem services going to look like in the next decades? And what's quite interesting about the global assessment, so that had in the end actually this call that we need transformative change to actually conserve biodiversity, and it's then essentially built the foundation for the transformative change assessment that we are reviewing at the moment. Next slide, please. And yes, and then this is the ongoing work program and timeline at the moment. So this program was approved at the 7th plenary in 2019. We've got currently 3 assessments ongoing. The Nexus assessment that David Ubura mentioned, which is currently undergoing review. The transformative change assessment, the review of this is actually coming up now. And then there's the business and biodiversity assessment. And there are a number of assessments that are planned and going to start in a few years, in the coming years, which is the second global assessment. So the call for experts for the scoping has been released. And then that's the one that we would actually like to motivate the GEO BON community to take part in. It's the assessment and monitoring of biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. And this is a fast track assessment, which means it doesn't undergo a scoping process, but actually there's been a scoping done through the IPBES plenary, been approved, and the experts will start directly with that assessment. And then in 2 years' time, there will be another fast track assessment on biodiversity, spatial planning, and ecological connectivity. And with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Letitia, who's going to tell you more about how to engage with IPBES.
Thank you, Cornelia. And yes, so I'm Leticia, and I'm a researcher at the Estación Biológica de Doñana in Spain, but I'm also involved in the GEO BON policy task force. And the reason why I'm talking to you about IPBES today is also because I was a lead author in one of the assessments, the assessment on land degradation and restoration. So I have this experience of going through the nomination process and then the whole assessment production. And also during my time at the GEO BON Secretariat, I was part of the GEO BON delegation at IPBES plenary. So that gave me the opportunity to see also the other side of the mirror. So I thought this could be an interesting experience to share also with all of you. So I'm going to focus on how you can engage with IPBES. So as was mentioned before, it could be through the review of assessment or by becoming an author. You could also think of becoming experts in the task forces. So I'll go briefly over all of those options and focus then on the calls that are actually open, which are the most pressing issues. Next slide. So starting with the review of assessment, we start with this because this is in a way the easiest way to engage, because there's no nomination process that is necessary. There are at the moment 2 calls that are open to review ongoing assessment. One is the Nexus assessment and the other is the Transformative Change assessment. So all you need to do, I'm pretty sure you need to create an account on the IPBES platform, but that's about it. Then you indicate your interest in reviewing the assessment, and then you'll have, it's pretty straightforward. You'll have some explanation on how to do it, what kind of feedback they're looking for, and so on. So I invite you also to consider those 2 opportunities. Next. But then you could also consider becoming an author in one of the assessments. So this slide is just to present you the different roles that exist within.
O Pepan colocou agora na nossa reunião. Quando houve a primeira
within an IPBES assessment, starting with the role of co-chairs. So these are the ones that oversee the preparation of the entire assessment. And that also includes the summary for policymaker, which is the summary of the entire assessment that is actively negotiated in the plenary of IPBES. And next to that are the coordinating lead authors. So for an assessment thing, there's generally 2 to 3 co-chairs, and the coordinating lead authors are at the level of chapters. So those coordinate the work of the lead authors of each chapters, as well as the fellows, the contributing authors, and they also assume the functions of lead authors. So each chapter would also have, at least in my experience, 2 to 3 coordinating lead authors. Then you have the lead authors. Those are the ones that produce different sections of the chapters. And so basically what they do is to synthesize material that is drawn from available literature, and also fully justified unpublished sources. And in addition to that, you also have the review editors. So it's different than the call to review that I just made before. These are review editors that are there to actually make sure that all the review that came from experts and governments are considered by the lead authors. A separate thing, as Cornelia mentioned, there's a very strong emphasis in IPBES in capacity building, and one of the ways it takes form is with the fellow program. So there's also open calls for fellows to participate in assessment and also work like lead authors, developing sections of the chapter. We put the time commitment as an indication, so I have to say I do not know what the time commitment is for co-chairs, but for coordinating lead authors, it should be about 20–25% of their time during the lifespan of the assessment, 15 to 20% for lead authors. I don't know exactly for review editors, and for fellows would be also 15%. So I said during the lifespan of an assessment, but in reality, you have to imagine that there's just going to be periods with a lot of demand to work on the chapters and others that are way less demanding. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, probably from the GEO BON perspective, the assessment that's the most relevant at the moment is the monitoring assessment. That is for which there's an open call for authors. So this was approved at the last plenary, and it's going to be a methodological assessment on the monitoring of biodiversity and nature's contributing to people. So they already determined that there's two objectives to this monitoring assessment. The first one is to support efforts to monitor biodiversity, nature's contribution to people, but also the direct and indirect underlying causes of change, but also to specifically monitor progress towards the goals and the targets of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was approved last year by the CBD, and to some extent also to contribute to monitoring the Sustainable Development Goals and other sets of goals and targets of multilateral environmental agreements. Next. So they are looking at the moment for experts and practitioners from academia, from governments, from the civil society with particular expertise. So they're looking for people with expertise in a range of disciplines. So we saw a lot of us are experts in ecology, biodiversity science, but here they're also interested in people that would have expertise in social science, for instance, economics, statistics, modeling as well. They're interested in experts that have expertise in monitoring biodiversity, but also nature's contribution to people, and importantly, in terrestrial freshwater and marine ecosystems. They're looking for expertise in the use of both in situ and remote sensing measurements, but also community-based monitoring and citizen science. Diverse and new technologies for monitoring biodiversity. So think eDNA, camera traps, hyperspectral imagery, AI, ecological acoustics, for instance. And they're also interested in authors that would have expertise with national and subnational monitoring programs and systems, including those led by Indigenous people and local communities, as well as global observing systems and citizen science initiative. And last but not least, they're also looking for some expertise in the development of indicators and the use of indicators in policy and decision-making, and institutional and financial requirements that could be used to strengthen monitoring systems. Next slide. Thanks. So this was for the monitoring assessment, but as Cornelia mentioned, there's also task forces within IPBES, and there's one, the Scenarios and Model Task Force, that has at the moment an open call for fellows. So the criteria for the fellows is indicative, but they're looking for people that are at an early stage in their career. So indicatively, they would be less than 35 years old and be 5 or 7 years since obtaining their PhD, when that's applicable. But again, this is indicative. The main activities of the Scenarios and Model Task Force is to support the use of scenarios and models in the assessment of IPBES, to develop the methodological guidance from the Nature Future Framework that is being developed by IPBES, but also to promote the dialogue between IPBES and the community of practice of scenarios and models. So in this case, the fellows that they're looking for should have expertise in qualitative and quantitative approaches to scenarios, models, and other future studies, including the Nature Future Framework, and also be able to effectively promote this dialogue between the task force and the communities of practice on scenarios and models. So then I'm gonna switch to the application and nomination process. So I hope we told you enough to get your interest in engaging with IPBES. So I'm briefly going to tell you how you can apply, what is the general nomination process, and then I'll pass again to Katie to more specifically discuss what is the nomination process with GEO BON. So the application process, it's pretty straightforward. In the nomination calls, but we can also share this with you on the chat and later via email, you'll have the link to the open call for experts. and you just need to create an account on the IPBES website before, and you need to be logged in before you submit your application. I checked briefly the other day for the monitoring assessment. What they ask for is your CV, a supporting statement, another statement explaining your specific expertise for this assessment, and they also ask you for a list of the 5 most relevant publications. So how this works, basically you go online, you fill out the application form, then you should receive a confirmation that this has been submitted. And when you do your application, you will choose either a government and or an organization to support your nomination. So when you send your application, then this government and this organization will receive an email informing them of that, and this was a link to approve your application. Then the government and or the organization should approve your application, and then both the supporting organization and yourself should receive an email confirming that everything has been submitted properly, and that then your application can go and be assessed by IPBES. So something that you need to keep in mind, and that was already mentioned by David earlier on, is that there's an IPBES rule that no more than 20% of the selected experts can be nominated by stakeholders or organizations such as GEO BON. So that means 80% of the experts are nominated by countries. So that means your chances of being nominated are higher if you're supported by a national government. Another important thing is that overall the selected group of experts should reflect a wide range of scientific, technical, and socioeconomic views and expertise, a diversity of knowledge system, as well as a good gender and geographic balance. Next slide. Thank you. On that note, this was presented in the IPBES webinar a couple of weeks ago. So this is the current geographic balance in experts up to this point, and you can see, for instance, that the percentage of experts from Eastern Europe is rather low in comparison to other regions. So if you are from this region, or if you know experts from this region, I also encourage you to apply and to reach out to them. One important point also is for I believe low and middle income countries, the IPBES Secretariat would offer financial support for the experts, that is to participate basically in the authors meeting. But for other experts, that you would have to check if this financial support exists with the nominating country or with their institution. Next slide. And so the process is that you should get in touch with your national focal point. There's a list of all the focal points on the IPBES website to check if to get the nomination by a national government. There is a specific, a slightly different process. We're going to tell you about the GEO BON process. So other organizations and countries might have their own approach to this. You can also get the nominations through your institution, although I have to say that we're not exactly clear on the process. So this is something that we want to look into and share the information with you as soon as we have it. And you can also send some questions. Well, we're going to have an open time for questions during this webinar, but afterwards you can also write to info@geobon.org. And one thing that we wanted to mention that is important is that most of the work of writing the chapter, of producing your chapter and the whole assessment is done remotely. But when you apply to be an expert, you should commit to participate in the in-person meetings. I guess this vary maybe from one assessment to the next, but it's generally 2 in-person meetings. And what you have to know also is that the GEO BON Secretariat cannot financially support your participation in those meetings. And I believe now is my time to give the floor back to Katie.
Thanks, Letitia. So I realize it's a lot of information, but we're going to answer your questions in a short moment. So like Letitia says, there is the process for application, but we as the organization GEO BON will, if you're seeking our endorsement, we will get a notification that we have pending nominees that we need to approve or endorse. So GEO BON itself has come up with some endorsement criteria so that we can select amongst the nominees that we're receiving. So on the screen, you'll see the criteria that we'll be mostly endorsing our nominees by. The first is subject area expertise. So if you're applying to the monitoring assessment, this is an essential component for us. So you must have some expertise in the areas that were listed in the notification from the IPBES Secretariat. Experience formulating advice for governments, public and international bodies is also useful as an asset. IPBES experience, previous experience is an asset, but it's not required here. And certainly this is not part of the fellow either. So if you're applying for the fellow assessment, then you don't necessarily need to have IPBES experience. It might be your first experience with IPBES. Career stage will priority to go to early to mid-career will be favored. And also it's important to know that some level of your job security at whatever current work contract you're on, it should last the duration of the assessment. So if the monitoring assessment is 2 years, you should be at your current institution for those 2 years. We like to make sure that our nominees that are endorsed have geographic and gender representation and they're balanced in that sense. There should also be an overall representation and balance in different scientific disciplines and interdisciplinarity of the people's profiles. So we should see some mixed representation there. If we are getting a lot of nominees being submitted, we will give priority to those that are not able to get endorsement from a country. So if you're only seeking GEO BON endorsement, there might be prioritization there. And of course, you must be an active member of GEO BON. You must be registered as a GEO BON member and have some knowledge of the GEO BON network itself and having previous engagement with the bonds, working groups, and task force, because you will be representing GEO BON. So we would like to know that you know what GEO BON does and you're an active member within the network. So for the process of seeking GEO BON endorsement, so please let us know that you are seeking endorsement by sending an email to us at info@geobon.org. And please, in the subject line, write nomination for IPBES assessment or task force. We would prefer that you do this 4 days prior to the application deadline on the IPBES website. So for the monitoring assessment, that means 15th of December. So the deadline for the application is the 19th of December, but GEO BON, we would like to get them from you by 15 December so that we have a chance to go through all the names and applications that we receive. In the email, please provide a short, around 200-word bio sketch of yourself, why you think you're qualified for this position and why you're seeking GEO BON endorsement, plus your CV. So most of these things are already being asked by the IPBES application anyway. So basically you're not replicating a lot of information there. And again, the internal deadlines for GEO BON is 4 days before the application deadline. Okay. So here are the deadlines for the open call. So the first one for the task force experts and the scoping experts for the second global assessment, that one is closed. It closed on 19 November. But what we're mostly focusing on today is the one that is due on December 19th, which is the experts for the monitoring assessment, the fellows for the monitoring assessment, those are the same deadlines, and the fellows for scenarios and models task force. So these are the open calls and the deadline for that. Lastly, the Nexus review deadline. So this, again, it doesn't require endorsement, but if you are interested in reviewing for that, the deadline is 14th of January. And you can see Oh yes, and all deadlines are at midnight CET time. So make sure that, well, that's mostly for us to know that. Okay, so I think now is a good time to open up the floor to questions. I see a few in the chat. There's in the chat and also the questions and answers. So I'll start with what I see in the chat. So first of all, we put the link to the IPBES national focal points. So if you're interested in knowing who they are from the country level, they're there. And then also the organization one. Maybe if Letitia, do you have that link that you can put in the chat? So you can search the list of organizations. Okay, so the first.
I'll look for it. I had it and I lost
it,
but I'll put it.
The first one I see is, can you please explain what the supporting statement is for? I did not understand this. So the supporting statement that is in the IPBES nomination, I believe that's the statement to define why you're qualified, but the supporting statement would come from us. So that's why we're asking for a bio sketch from you so that we can write an informed statement saying that we support this candidate for these reasons. So that is something that we would write. It would be helpful if we have more information on you personally. So that's why we're asking for a short bio sketch. Does that answer the question? Okay, thanks, Anna.
Kitty?
Yes.
Hello?
Who is that? Sorry, I can't see who that is.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I wanted to add, because the supporting statement is something that they ask specifically on the application form on the IPBES website. However, there is no extra information. So for instance, when they ask you for the to describe your specific expertise relevant to the call, they specifically said that you have to explain to make clear reference to the expertise required for this assessment. However, the supporting statement is it's just that, it's just a supporting statement. So this is a question that we could also ask the IPBES secretariat. I understand it as a cover letter of sorts.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. So it's not the letter in support of GEO BON that GEO BON would give in support of the candidate. It's what the candidate writes for themselves. Yeah. Okay.
For the IPBES on the IPBES platform. Yeah. About that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm really highly confused, I must say, because this is like two very different information. So if you could ask and share the answer with us, I think that would be really helpful, because basically, I mean, there's other places in the application to already state why we want to participate and what is our expertise. So I'm just not sure, right, what they expect there. So that would be great.
Yeah. I'll add it to the list of questions. Yeah.
Okay, continuing in the chat, Sean asks, how many authors will be selected for the report? Tens or hundreds? Cornelia, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can answer that. So there were about 130 authors in a global assessment. It's about the same number of authors for the Nexus assessment. The scenarios models had about 80 authors. So they're usually a team of 10 to 15 authors per chapter. So I would expect, again, for the monitoring assessment, 70, 80 authors that are being nominated, and selected.
How does the process work if one goes through a national government nomination? So Letitia, do you want to answer that one?
I can, but the answer is going to be depends on the national government. So, for instance, I got in touch with the focal point of Spain to get a nomination, and it's pretty straightforward. He was interested in the CV and cover letter, which are the same information that I would have to put in the IPBES form. But it didn't seem to me like there was a process before I sent my application. Other countries where they may offer financial support to the experts, they might want to do a selection process ahead of that. So I cannot really answer that question. My advice to you would be to get in touch with the national focal points as soon as possible, so that you could ask them directly about that. I don't know, Cornelia, if you want to add anything.
I would actually say exactly the same. So for Switzerland as well, it's you contact the national focal point to actually let them know that you would like to be nominated, and then they actually ask you for exactly the same information that you need to put in on the IPBES website, and for them you actually also, for Switzerland, from the national focal point, you also put a kind of a statement together what your expertise is and why you a good fit for the assessment or for the task force, because they will base their supporting letter on what you've actually wrote. Yeah. And there's actually a question that says if you can receive a nomination from a country that is not a member of IPBES, or at least an observer, and I'm not actually sure how that process would actually work, because you would need if you get nominated through a country, you need to go through the national focal point. So that's another question that we need to ask IPBES, whether that would actually work.
I think the answer is yes, because that was raised during the webinar that IPBES organized, but I'm not sure how. So on the list of questions for them.
Okay, and then how about the next question? Will GEO BON endorse fellows for the monitoring biodiversity and nature contributions to people? Yes, absolutely, we will. Just like we will endorse experts, we will be endorsing fellows too. And then this person is looking for a particular professor. Wouldn't my nominee organization. So Letitia, about an institution, I think maybe this is more of an institutional question.
Let me check. This is in the Q&A.
It's in the question and answer from Gabriella. Maybe Gabriella, if you're on the call, do you want to ask your question live? Are you seeking endorsement from your university?
Yeah, I was just curious what constitutes a nominating organization. I can't seem to search anything in that link there.
So this is another thing that I learned personally when the IPBES Secretariat organized this webinar a couple of weeks ago, that your research institute, for instance, or university, the head of the department could also nominate you. However, because they're not listed as there's no such thing as a focal point, they're not listed on the IPBES website, I am not sure how this will work. So this is also I know this is already something that we need to ask. So we'll get back to you on that when we figure out the process. So it is short answer, it is possible, but we don't know how yet.
Okay, great, thank you.
Exactly. So there's another question in the chat by Frank, and it's like, yes, indeed, there are hundreds of organizations, and there is no guarantee that GEO BON nominee will be selected. We can never guarantee that. It's the MEP and it's the MEP and Bureau who's actually looking at these nominations, and based on the CVs, previous experience, they will actually, and then taking into consideration gender balance, etc., they'll then select the persons they think are best for the assessment. So we can't, if we nominate you through GEO BON, we cannot, the nomination doesn't guarantee that you will be selected. However, if you, I mean, especially if you now work for, focus on a marine environment, I think the chances are actually really high that you be selected, because that's something, there's actually niches that they actually really need to fill to make sure that they cover the topics of the assessment. The similar with social sciences, there's always a dearth of social sciences within the assessment that are being looked for. And so your chances, if you like, in these disciplines are higher that you being selected. Yeah.
And just to add to that, Cornelia, so my understanding from attending the IPBES webinar is that there's no limit to the number of nominees we can actually submit. But of course, it doesn't guarantee that you're selected, but it is also on the part of the IPBES Secretariat team to, select the best candidates there. So if you might pass our endorsement, but you might not pass IPBES's selection, basically is the answer there. Yeah. So on the website, it says that organizations that are not connected with IPBES can nominate people. It's not clear for countries. Yeah, I think we'll have to ask that question to the IPBES. Do you know how many will be selected from terrestrial and marine? Again, that's a very niche question. I think there are areas where there are missing experts, so those get priority, but I think they try to keep them balanced. Frank, did you raise your hand there?
Frank needs to leave.
Oh, okay, he's just waving goodbye. All right. Goodbye, Frank.
Bye, Frank. Yeah, but maybe I can pick up on Sean's question that says what happens if they end up lacking expertise for all the chapters, hypothetically, if there were no nominated authors with expertise in genetic diversity. Yes, there's actually something in place, what they call a gap-filling mechanism. So once they actually have then their experts selected for the assessment, and they find that there are gaps, there will actually be an informal process in seeking further authors to the assessment. The other thing that we actually haven't mentioned is that actually the coordinating lead authors and lead authors are also free to contact other people, organize contributing authors to write very specific sections for an assessment. But they're not necessarily then named as assessment authors. So there are various mechanisms to actually fill those gaps. And yes, the chapter topics are already determined. So there's no scoping process for the monitoring assessment. The scoping has already been done, and we can actually link to the IPBES decision. It's actually on the IPBES website, I think, the scoping for the monitoring assessment. So it's already the content of the assessment roughly has been determined already. Yeah. Okay, so Leticia, link to
I just put the link to the PDF.
Okay, I see no new questions. I think in the chat. Any questions that have come up that you'd like to ask live?
I do have another question. In terms of the criteria for, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
In terms of the criteria for the fellows, you mentioned that it's best to be 5 to 7 years post PhD, essentially. I finished just last year, but I've done a postdoc and started as assistant professor. Would I not be competitive at all, or would you encourage applying anyway to the fellowship program?
So you finished your PhD last year?
Yeah, technically in May, and then I did a postdoc on a Fulbright in Mexico, with IPBES folks actually, like Patty Balvanera, and now I've started a faculty position.
So I'm gonna ask Cornelia to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you would be a perfect candidate for a fellow.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about as well. I think you're perfect.
Yeah.
I think it's the maximum is 5 to 7 years after your PhD.
Okay. I thought that was the target, right? Okay.
Yeah, you are actually perfectly on target. Yeah. Exactly. What I actually wanted to mention as well is we've been talking mostly about the experts for the assessments, and but we also need people for the task forces. I think the scenario we're still looking for fellows for the scenarios and modeling task force, and I think that's also really interesting to work with, because the modeling, the scenarios and modeling task force is really further developing the scenarios that are actually going to be used then in upcoming global assessments. So that's also really interesting to work with. And then the other thing is, even if you don't get selected for any of the assessments, it's still very worthwhile to actually do the assessment reviews, because that's always also an opportunity to bring in your expertise and knowledge, because the authors can never cover everything. So there's an opportunity for you to also point out important papers that have been written, or areas of your expertise to say that you feel that actually needs to be included in the assessment. And also, I think what's also really important is there's always, when the assessments are written, there's also a process that actually looks at the gaps in knowledge. And there's a gap filling process again then in place to generate the new science to fill those gaps. So when you do the reviews, do not only pay attention to what is already known, but actually where the gaps are and where we should actually further the science and the knowledge as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Cornelia.
Yeah, thank you.
So like we said in the chat, we'll send these questions to the IPBES by the end of today, and we'll hopefully, as soon as we get the answers back, we'll share them with you along with the recording and the slides, so you'll have the information there.
Exactly. There was one last minute question that asked whether doctoral students can apply to be fellow in IPBES.
I think so, but I want to double check. Don't take my word for it. I guess it depends also how far into your doctoral program you are.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, we'll double check.
Exactly. And Maria has another question. She's still here.
Yes, maybe it's faster if I ask. So at the IPBES website, it mentioned that if we want to be nominated by a nation, it will be good to contact them in advance and see what are the priorities of the nation and biodiversity. Is it something that we need to include in their statement to make sure we align also with the interest of the nation? And if our expertise or work, it fits well with the interest of IPBES, but not necessarily on the national level, that will be a problem?
That's a good question that I can't answer at the moment. I mean that the thing is like the final decision is not made by the country whether you're actually then an expert in an assessment, but it's actually done by the multidisciplinary expert panel who actually looks at who has the expertise to actually do this assessment. So I mean, it might make you might need to convince the national focal point a bit more if you're not really aligned with them whether you want to be nominated, but it's not detrimental then for your selection as an expert, IPBES experts. That would be my thoughts. Yeah. Yes.
Abukari is.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Abubakari from Tanzania, and of course, currently I'm in the final stages of my PhD. And yeah, so in terms of age, I was interested to apply for to be a fellow. And why? Because basically I'm more involved on the modeling, using machine learning. And recently I just published a paper on Marula tree subspecies at the global scale. And currently it's just online. And the second paper just been accepted today, also on the modeling. So I was a bit interested, but when it comes to age, I'm a bit more than 35 years. So, but also have not yet graduated, but already currently my thesis is already in place, and hopefully next year by end of May, I've already graduated. So my question is, can I also qualify to apply as a fellow on that? Yeah, thank you.
So congratulations on your paper. I would say, so I wouldn't be too concerned about your age because this is just indicative. The really important thing is the stage in your career, in which case I think I want to say that you would qualify, but because you haven't finished yet, that's the part that I want. You haven't finished yet your PhD, right? That's what you were saying.
Yes.
So that's just the part that I would want to double check with the IPBES secretariat. I'm almost certain that yes, but I'm not sure. And other than that, I think either the task force or the monitoring assessment would be good fit. But yeah, let us just check the part on if you qualify, if you haven't quite finished defended the PhD.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? No? So just a reminder that if you're interested in seeking endorsement, to please send us an email to info@geobon.org. I could put that in the chat. So that we know, and then we will share the recording and all this information, and like we said, the answers to your questions as soon as we get them.
Yeah.
Any last comments, questions, Letitia or Cornelia?
Not from my side.
Oh, here's yeah, so exactly. So just write an email to info@geobon.org. That will go to the GeoBon network. So it'll go to the correct people. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. This was good. We hope you learned a lot or learned some things. And thank you, Cornelia and Letitia, for your time. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.